Shell, in response to knowing about the climate change problem, didn't change its business model, it just changed its advertising strategy. Overall, fossil fuel companies are responsible for about 50%, half of today's global temperature rise, and about 30% of the global sea level rise. So as an industry, they bear a ginormous responsibility for this problem. And Shell, of course, is the largest privately owned fossil fuel company, and it's one of the really big oil players. Big Oil has been using the tobacco playbook for years. So first, deny there's a problem. Then, when there's clearly a problem, try and muddy the waters about the causal relationship between your products and that problem. And then, when there's overwhelming evidence that your products are causing the problem, try and shift responsibility for the solution onto the taxpayer. The documents that we've seen show that Shell knew about the problem of climate change, and they got their internal scientists and some external US academics to look at the problem and look at what climate change was, how serious it was going to be, and how its products interacted with that problem. Now, what it really explicitly shows is that Shell knew 30 years ago that burning oil and gas, burning the products that it sells, contribute to climate change. The emissions from those products drive climate change. There can be no doubt about that at all. And actually, on a couple of issues, Shell were ahead of the curve. So in some early documents, it shows it's really concerned about what climate change will mean for migration. So we're talking about climate refugees here. We're talking about them talking about climate refugees in the 80s and 90s, long before actually most politicians or the public really understood this problem. They know that sea levels will rise, flooding events will become more common, and they even actually quote and point to the example of Bangladesh, where they can show that there might be these mass migrations of people away from areas that are becoming uninhabitable because of climate change. Now, of course, Bangladesh recently has had some terrible flooding events. So if Shell knew that that was going to be a problem, what did they do about it? Well, they continued to explore for fossil fuels. They didn't change their business model. They just told the world that they were going to, and they continue to say that now. Now, these documents that we've seen from Shell in the early 1980s make it really explicit that climate change is a problem and Shell's products are responsible for it. But what you see in the other documents that move slightly more away from the science and slightly more into the business is that they suddenly start really emphasising the uncertainty. So while there are a few outliers, there's a few outlier studies that maybe suggest climate change isn't as serious a problem as the vast majority of studies do, those are the ones they decide to emphasise. And they really put the emphasis on the minority rather than going with the consensus view. So at the same time as Shell was internally acknowledging that climate change was a problem and it had some responsibility towards it, it massively expanded, particularly during the 90s. It expanded into deep water drilling, one of those places being the Gulf of Mexico, where BP famously had its terrible oil spill, one of the worst oil spills we've ever seen. It also expanded into the tricky waters on the Norwegian side of the North Sea. So they were expanding into harder to reach, more dangerous places. It also looked at drilling in the Arctic. It's been pressuring policymakers and politicians to try and allow it to drill in these incredibly fragile places because it wants more fossil fuels. So it just shows that there is a real incongruence between what they're saying internally and what they're doing in terms of their business model. They continue to invest 95% of their resources in fossil fuels and 5% in low carbon solutions. Shell's public position on climate change recently has been that it believes climate change is real, it believes it's a problem, it understands that fossil fuels contribute to this. However, it's not really willing to take action on its own. It consistently asks governments and taxpayers to take the burden of the costs of taking action and the solutions for this. Now, one way that it's starting to try and influence debate around this is by producing these kind of quasi-academic studies that show really impressive graphs and really impressive numbers about how Shell's business, how Shell's fossil fuel business can survive in a low-carbon world. Now, the latest one of these was called the Sky scenario, and a lot of analysts have gone through this, and it's been really heavily criticised because it has this massive reliance on carbon capture and storage technology. Carbon capture and storage is a silver bullet for this industry. As far as they're concerned, it allows power plants to be fitted with technology that take the carbon dioxide emissions and they can then lock those away underground. Now, the problem with this is it's still unproven. It hasn't been done at scale on a power plant. It's also incredibly expensive. And instead of a multi-billion-dollar organisation like Shell taking responsibility for that and spending their own money on that, they want governments to give them huge grants, huge subsidies to get this technology going. They know those governments are unlikely to give them the money for that, But it sounds like they're suggesting a solution while being allowed to just carry on as usual, extracting, producing, selling fossil fuels. The second part of that is a carbon price. Now, a strong carbon price would be a wonderful thing if we could get it going globally, if we could make it work, if we could factor the cost of carbon into the cost of these products. Shell know that's not going to happen, which is why they continue to push for it. And in the examples where it has been tried, for example, the EU emissions trading scheme, Shell and other industries have weakened these schemes sufficiently through lobbying, through their policy recommendations, to make sure that actually it doesn't really work. Particularly in the US, it gives a huge amount of money to individual policymakers through various foundations, through employee foundations and PACs, to try and influence the way they vote. And there's all the data that shows that's been really effective over time. They lobby against renewables, they lobby against energy efficiency, and they lobby for tax cuts for the industry. In the UK, because it's a UK registered company joining the Netherlands, it also has a huge amount of clout. So it's managed to get North Sea tax breaks again and again and again. It's been allowed to carry on doing its activities in the North Sea with limited regulation, with limited oversight for decades. This already came out as well, of course, in the Brent Spar controversy many years ago, where Greenpeace ended up occupying a platform because it wasn't satisfied with Shell's suggestion about what it wanted to do with that. That really was effective because ultimately Shell ended up, instead of dumping it in the Atlantic, reusing a lot of that platform for its activities elsewhere. So it does show that people can have some influence over this. They sponsor these events, they put on these big glossy events like the Make the Future event that we've just seen happen in London, where they get pop stars and they get comedians to come along and endorse their products. They try and tell the world that basically they're a friendly, lovely company. It's greenwash while entertaining the kids. They then produce these adverts that have smiling children in schools, show their workers interacting in developing countries, helping these countries supposedly come out of poverty, when all they're really doing is pushing these countries along a fossil fuel path that everyone knows is ultimately unsustainable and is going to create a lot of the problems that Shell 30 years ago were talking about. Shell maintains that the only way to develop out of poverty is by using fossil fuels to industrialise your economy. Now, everyone knows that actually today that's just not true. Particularly in countries where they have real problems with linking up their electricity and their power sector and delivering power from big old-fashioned fossil fuel power stations to local communities. Things like localised renewables actually make a lot more sense. Why not have a solar panel or a small wind development directly next to where that power is needed? So people know that actually there's other ways to develop out of this supposed energy poverty. Interestingly, of course, Shell doesn't really invest in those things, so it's not particularly keen on promoting them. The other way, of course, as well, is cutting energy use, improving energy efficiency, making homes more efficient to heat and cool, using power more effectively, making appliances and all the gadgets you have more energy efficient. Again, that means reducing demand, reducing Shell's customer base. So it's something that they don't invest in and they don't promote. There's a few ways that individuals can get involved to remind Shell of its responsibility to the issue of climate change. One is through shareholder activism, so turning up at AGMs and asking really awkward questions. At Shell's recent AGM, they were forced to answer hours of questions on climate change, and embarrassingly for them, they couldn't, and the world was shown that. Another way is by turning up at things like the Make the Future resistance, pointing out that this is greenwash, through joining things like the divestment movement, which is encouraging things like pension funds to get people's money out of dirty investments. And of course the last one is trying to remind people about unnecessary new fossil fuel developments. So things like the frack-free movements, which are protesting against fracking in this country. Getting together as a community group to really work out how you can make your own community more sustainable.
Our future, not Shell! Our future, not Shell!